The auctioneer brought the gavel down at $295 on a cold, clear October morning in 2006 at the Penobscot Bay Lobster Pound Cooperative Surplus Equipment Auction on the Stonington Town Dock at the head of Stonington Harbor, Maine, and the broad-shouldered man in the deep navy heavy wool sea captain's coat, with the small embroidered red and white Penobscot Bay Lobster Pound patch, over the left chest pocket, standing at the side of the cinder block surplus shed, let out a thin, clipped laugh through his teeth that turned the heads of every Down East Maine commercial fishing truck mechanic standing along the chain link. Holcomb Sawyer was 54, 5'11", and broad through the shoulders like a coastal Maine lobsterman who had become management 20 years ago. Thinning, silver-gray hair combed straight back from a salt wind-burned high forehead under a navy wool sea captain's cap with a polished brass anchor badge, a clean-shaven, heavy jaw, sharp, pale ice blue eyes set deep above a Maine Down East salt tan. He wore a deep navy heavy wool double-breasted sea captain's coat with 2 rows of polished brass buttons over a crisp, pale yellow cotton Oxford shirt buttoned to the throat, a dark green silk-striped tie, dark gray heavy duck trousers belted with a thick brown leather belt, with a polished brass Penobscot Bay anchor and lobster buckle, polished black leather lace-up Down East dock boots, a small enameled Penobscot Bay Lobster Pound cooperative lapel pin on the left lapel beside a small brass Maine Lobstermen's Association member pin, a heavy gold University of Maine class ring on his right ring finger, a thin silver pocket watch chain looped from a vest button to a vest pocket beneath the navy wool. A weathered cordovan leather field portfolio sat tucked under his left arm. He had been owner of Penobscot Bay Lobster Pound Cooperative on the Stonington Waterfront for 19 years, and the surplus auction had been called to clear forfeited contractor iron from the cooperative's independent Deer Isle commercial fishing dock recovery contracts after a 1988 lien default. The 1959 FWD CU-12 wrecker at the back of the auction list had been on the cooperative's contractor default ledger since 1988, and Holcomb had told the auctioneer privately he would have paid the auctioneer a $100 handshake to make the truck disappear before the auction even opened. The 24-year-old Down East Maine commercial fishing truck mechanic at the back of the bidder's line in the deeply faded indigo canvas dock shop coat had just outbid the cooperative for $295 against Holcomb's casual $50 opening shot. And Holcomb was making sure the Stonington dock hands understood the joke. Wendell Sprague folded the auction slip into the inside pocket of his dock shop coat and walked through the cold gravel to the truck. The FWD CU-12 was 21 feet of long-nose conventional cab heavy-duty wrecker, with the late 1950s FWD vertical bar chrome grille and the polished chrome FWD Shield script badge across the front of the long hood. The cab painted a faded Stonington granite buff, oxidized to chalky bone along the body panels and dusty pale gray along the upper edges of the doors and roof, the chrome FWD Shield script badge tarnished, both round chrome side cab mirrors snapped off at the brackets, the original Holmes 500 wrecker boom with a single drum winch mounted on the rear deck listing 2 degrees right with a frayed cable, the wooden cargo deck planks rotted, 3 of the 6 tires flat, and the word "junk" spray-painted in flaking dock paint red block letters across the driver's door. Inside the cab, the kick panel below the dashboard on the driver's side shows impact damage from the 1988 Deer Isle Bridge approach, black ice rollover. Wendell had grown up on a small commercial lobsterman's homestead 3 miles north of the truck's last parking spot on Deer Isle. His grandfather, Ezra Sprague, was waiting at the trailer. Ezra was 78, a retired Crotch Island granite quarry crane mechanic who had worked the quarry crane shop for 40 years between 1948 and 1988. 6 foot, lean and erect with broad, bony shoulders, snow-white hair clipped close under a faded navy blue wool fisherman's watch cap, a thick white mustache, deep, watery ice-blue eyes set in a Maine Down East, salt and wind-weathered face, large, knotted hands. A short-stemmed briar pipe sat unlit between his teeth. He wore a faded indigo canvas dock shop coat unbuttoned over a faded, heavy charcoal and cream buffalo check wool work shirt buttoned to the throat. Faded, dark gray, heavy duck trousers held up with thick brown leather suspenders, scuffed black leather lace-up Down East dock boots, and a plain dark brown leather belt with a worn brass buckle stamped with a small Crotch Island granite derrick silhouette. Ezra set one liver-spotted hand on the rusted bumper of the CU-12 and stood there a long minute. He spoke quietly. He said, "Son, you bought Calvin Greenlaw's old CU-12?" Calvin Greenlaw had run Greenlaw Deer Isle Recovery out of a small board and batten dock shop on Main Route 15 outside Stonington from 1976 until the rollover, pulling overturned commercial lobster trucks out of the steep Deer Isle Bridge approach, switchback above Eggemoggin Reach. He had built the Holmes 500 wrecker boom himself onto the CU-12's rear deck in 1977. He had married a Stonington girl named Tabitha Hutchinson in 1981, and they had a daughter, Eleanor, born in 1985. Calvin had died in September of 1988. He had been hauling a stuck Penobscot Bay commercial lobster truck up the steep Deer Isle Bridge approach, switchback above Eggemoggin Reach in a wet, early September freezing rain, when his own CU-12 caught black ice on the outside shoulder and slid over the edge and rolled twice down a 40-foot granite ledge slope. He had died at the scene. He was 43. Eleanor was 3. The CU-12 had been recovered up out of the granite ledge slope by another wrecker out of Blue Hill and parked behind the Greenlaw dock shop on Main Route 15. Tabitha had paid the property tax for 1 year, until the 1988 lien default and Penobscot Bay Lobster Pound Cooperative had taken the property through Holcomb Sawyer's contracted default desk. The CU-12 had sat in the back of the cooperative's surplus shed on the Stonington town dock for 19 more years, until the surplus auction. Wendell had been at the auction because his grandfather had heard from a Crotch Island retiree that Calvin Greenlaw's truck was finally being sold. They winched the CU-12 onto Wendell's borrowed flatbed trailer. Holcomb Sawyer stood at the side of the auction tent in his deep navy heavy wool sea captain's coat and watched, the polished brass anchor badge on his cap catching the cool morning light. And as Wendell pulled out, he called across the gravel that when the boy was ready to admit defeat, Penobscot Bay Lobster Pound would arrange disposal for $100 cash. Wendell did not answer. Ezra climbed into the cab of the trailer truck, and they drove 6 miles north up Main Route 15 to Ezra's red cedar Down East frame shop outside Stonington, the Holmes 500 boom pointing at the cool gray October Maine sky like a bent finger. The restoration would take 19 years. Nobody knew that on the drive north. Wendell worked his day job at a heavy truck shop in Blue Hill during the week and drove 20 minutes north to Ezra's shop every Saturday and most Sundays. They started with the cab dash and the driver's side kick panel because Ezra insisted. The FWD CU-12 cab dashboard had taken some of the rollover impact, and the kick panel below the dashboard on the driver's side had been pushed inward by the impact. They removed the original dash for inspection and set it on the bench. They unbolted the driver's side kick panel inner trim from the inside of the cab firewall and set the panel on sawhorses in the corner of the Down East frame shop. They pulled the Continental F244 cubic inch inline-six gasoline engine out of the truck and tore it down on a stand. The bearings were salvageable, the crank true, the head needed a careful regrind. They pulled the 4-speed Spicer manual and pressed new bushings into the shift tower. The first long Maine winter went into the engine and into stories about Calvin Greenlaw. He told stories about Tabitha Greenlaw's haddock chowder and the night in 1981 when Calvin pulled a stuck Penobscot Bay commercial lobster truck out of a switchback at -12 degrees and refused payment except for a bushel of fresh Stonington lobsters. The second year, they sand-blasted the rollover rusted frame down to clean steel. By the 5th year, the cab came off. In the 7th year, Ezra slowed. He had a small heart attack in March and was at Blue Hill Memorial Hospital for 11 days. He came home thinner and quieter, but his hand still worked. He told Wendell the truck would wait. By the 10th year, the CU-12 was a roller. In the 12th year, Wendell's daughter was born, and the work paused for a month. By the 15th year, Ezra sat more than he stood. He worked from a folding wooden chair beside the Down East frame shop's cast-iron stove, the faded navy blue wool fisherman's watch cap pulled low, the short-stem briar pipe between his teeth, pointing at what to do next. Through all those years, Holcomb Sawyer drove past Ezra's gravel drive in his forest green Lincoln Continental with the Penobscot Bay Lobster Pound decal on the windshield. The Lincoln always slowed, but never quite turned in. By the 16th year, the CU-12 was painted. They had wet-sanded and primed and laid down a deep, glossy Stonington granite buff that matched a faded snapshot Ezra had of the truck from 1978, and they had masked off the driver's door with blue painter's tape around a rectangle where the flaking dock paint red junk paint still showed through, and they had left it there. Wendell did not know why. He just left it. By the 18th year, the Holmes 500 boom was rebuilt with a fresh aircraft-grade single-drum cable. By the 19th year, the CU-12 was nearly whole. They had not yet bolted the driver's side kick panel inner trim back into the cab firewall. The kick panel was the last thing on the list, because Ezra always said you finish with what keeps her driver dry on a Deer Isle Bridge approach, black ice call. On a cool, clear morning of September the 22nd of the 19th year, Wendell pulled into Ezra's Down East frame shop with a fresh roll of kick panel adhesive trim and a half-inch socket. He was 43. The brown at his temples had gone steady silver. The small white scar across the back of his right forearm from a snapped FWD U-bolt in 2014 was a faint line, and his hands had the thickness of a man who had spent half his life under hoods. Ezra was 97. He sat on his folding wooden chair beside the Down East frame shop's cast-iron stove with a heavy plaid wool blanket over his knees. the faded navy blue wool fisherman's watch cap pulled low, the short-stemmed briar pipe between his teeth. Wendell walked to the driver's side kick panel inner trim on its sawhorses and started to scrape the old kick panel adhesive trim off the back of the panel. He stopped. There was a small hand-welded steel pocket arc-welded to the inside of the cab firewall directly behind where the kick panel had sat at knee height, the weld bead hand-applied. Wendell set down the socket. He took a thin, cold chisel and a small ball-peen hammer and gently cracked the weld around the small pocket. The pocket came free in his hand. He carried the pocket to the workbench under the clip-on lamp and slit the soldered seam with a heated putty knife and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in 2 layers of waxed canvas bound with brown twine, were 4 things. There was a tight roll of folded $20 bills wrapped with a piece of brown twine, 75 bills in 1980s Federal Reserve paper, totaling $1,500. There was a small brass Maine lobsterman's lapel pin with a small enameled lobster and Maine coast emblem in the center, and the engraved words Maine Lobstermen's Association / Charter Member / 1931 around the brass face above 3 small initials. There was a small black and white photograph mounted on stiff paperboard showing a small girl of about 3 in a faded yellow cotton sundress, standing on the wooden plank of the Stonington town dock, holding a small polished green glass float in her hand on Lobster Boat Race Day, the date October 1985 written on the back in pencil, and there was a folded single sheet of plain yellowed lined paper, the creases brittle, the ink faded, but legible. Wendell unfolded it. The handwriting was small and careful and slanted slightly to the right. The letter was dated September the 22nd of 1988. It read, "To my Eleanor. The cash is for whatever a young woman needs at 18 when Down East cannot hold her. The pin is your grandfather Linwood's. He was a 1931 charter member of the Maine Lobstermen's Association out of Stonington, and he wore it on his oilskin every season until he gave it to me on my 18th birthday in 1963. The photograph is of you, the morning your grandfather walked you down to the Stonington town dock for Lobster Boat Race Day. I am welding this pocket inside the cab firewall behind the kick panel because the Deer Isle Bridge approach black ice has been heavy for 3 Septembers running, and I do not want anything lost if the outside shoulder gives way on the next commercial lobster truck call. The truck is yours when you're old enough to drive her without breaking her. Your father, Calvin Greenlaw, Stonington, Maine, September 22nd, 1988. Wendell sat on the workbench. He read the letter twice. He handed it to his grandfather, and Ezra held it in both hands and read it once and set it down. He said quietly, "Calvin wrote this 5 days before the outside shoulder gave way on Deer Isle Bridge approach. The girl never knew." They drove south to Stonington the next Saturday. Ezra had called a Crotch Island retiree whose niece kept the Stonington Waterfront sea salt licensing office, and she gave them a current address for Eleanor Greenlaw Hutchinson at a small sea salt evaporator on the Stonington waterfront. They drove south on Maine Route 15 under a clear, cool October Maine morning, past long stands of mature white birch, and parked in front of a small clapboard sea salt evaporator operation office with a hand-painted wooden sign above the door reading Greenlaw Hutchinson Stonington Sea Salt. The woman who came out of the office in a faded canvas evaporator apron was 40. She had Calvin Greenlaw's broad shoulders and her father's deep, ice-blue eyes. She wore a faded khaki canvas evaporator apron over a faded heavy charcoal and cream buffalo check wool work shirt, faded dark gray heavy duck trousers, scuffed black leather lace-up Down East dock boots, a small silver Lobster and Maine coast pendant at her throat, gold wedding band. Ezra spoke first. He said, "Ma'am, I knew your father. He worked on his CU-12 in my Down East frame shop in 1985. My grandson here bought the FWD at the Penobscot Bay Lobster Pound Surplus Auction on the Stonington Town Dock 19 years ago, and we have been restoring her ever since. And we found something welded inside her cab firewall behind the kick panel that belongs to you." Eleanor's face changed. She brought them into a small evaporator office kitchen, and they sat at a round white oak farm office table, and Wendell set the 4 items down one at a time. The cash first, then the brass pin, then the photograph. He saved the letter for last. Eleanor picked up the brass Maine lobsterman's pin. She turned it slowly between her fingers and read the engraving around the brass face. She said her grandfather Linwood had been a 1931 charter member of the Maine Lobstermen's Association out of Stonington, that the family had been told the pin had been sold to a Bar Harbor antique dealer in 1971 after Linwood died, and that she had been looking through Down East estate sales for 25 years for that pin. She picked up the photograph. She held it for a long time. She read the letter twice. She did not cry until the second reading. She asked finally if she could see the truck. They drove her north to Ezra's Down East frame shop the next morning. Eleanor walked slowly around the CU-12 3 times in the open bay. She ran her hand along the chrome FWD shield script badge on the front of the long hood and the late 1950s FWD vertical bar chrome grille. She stood at the driver's door where the flaking dock paint red junk was still masked off in blue tape. She turned to Wendell and asked the price. Wendell looked at his grandfather. Ezra laid both hands on his knees and said, "Ma'am, the truck is yours, but not the way you mean. We are going to finish her. We are going to paint over the door so the junk is gone, and then we are going to drive her down Main Route 15 to the empty board and batten lot where Greenlaw Deer Isle Recovery stood until September of 1988. And we are going to paint your father's name on the door in clean white the way he did in 1976. The boy paid $295 at auction. The truck is his on the paper. The work is his by the doing, but the name on the door belongs to your father and your grandfather and you. They finished the CU-12 through that winter. Eleanor drove up from her sea salt evaporator every other Sunday. On the morning of April the 27th of the 20th year, they rolled the CU-12 out of Ezra's Down East frame shop under a clear blue Maine sky and drove her in convoy south on Main Route 15 to the empty board and batten lot where Greenlaw Deer Isle Recovery had stood until September of 1988. Wendell handed Eleanor a small can of deep Stonington granite buff paint and a 1-inch brush. Eleanor climbed up on the running board and painted out the flaking dock paint red junk on the driver's door. She waited an hour. She opened a can of clean white lettering paint, and in her father's careful slant, she painted across the door in clean, clear letters, Greenlaw Deer Isle Recovery, established 1976, old enough to drive her without breaking her. She stepped down. A polished forest green Lincoln Continental went by on Main Route 15. Holcomb Sawyer was driving. He slowed almost to a stop. He looked at the CU-12 at the empty board and batten lot, with the granite buff door and the clean white lettering. He looked at the four people on the gravel. He did not laugh. He drove on. The CU-12 sits on Main Route 15 outside Stonington today, and the sign on the door reads, Greenlaw Deer Eisel Recovery, established 1976. Eleanor runs the sea salt evaporator on the Stonington waterfront. The $1,500 sits in a small lockbox at her evaporator office. The 1931 Maine Lobstermen's Association charter pin sits beside it. The 1985 Stonington Town Dock photograph is framed above her kitchen table. The letter is in a small fireproof safe in her closet. She reads it once a year on the 22nd of September. If you ever see an old FWD CU-12 wrecker parked along Main Route 15 outside Stonington with the words Greenlaw Deer Isle Recovery painted on the door in clean white, slow down. Roll the window down and listen. There is a story in that truck that a Penobscot Bay lobster pound owner in a deep navy heavy wool sea captain's coat would have arranged disposal for $100 cash, and the work was always for the daughter. Subscribe to Iron Hook Stories for a new story every day. Thank you for watching.